Hi, everybody. I'm super pumped to bring you this new episode of Common Ground. And here is my co host, David Hamilton from the America's Future series, as well as our new guest, Richard Hanania, the author of Origins of the Woke, which is a book that came out recently that I've read. And I have to say, it's very good. And thank you for coming on, Richard.
Yeah, thank you. You moved the article around. You said origins of the woke. It's the origins of woke. But yeah, great to be here.
Amazing. So, with your book, I know it's a good argument when I read it and when I start the thesis, I I'm like, I don't fully get that, and I'm not sure of that. But when I end it, I think, damn, that actually adds up. And so, can you explain your argument for how wokeness originated and how it spread across society so quickly?
Yeah, I mean, so we have to, define wokeness first. I think that a good definition will say, look, it's about the idea we care about disparities, we care about whites doing better than non-whites, men doing better than women on on some measures we care about. There is speech restrictions in the service of overcoming disparities, and then you sort of have a bureaucracy that is there to enforce speech codes and then
Yeah.
to help overcome disparities, right? And so I think this, covers it. I think this covers it. And what's fascinating about this is that, like, if you actually know a little bit about the history of the law, a lot of these things were law before they were part of the culture. So people think it's sort of a recent thing to say if a test shows a disparity between two groups, the test must be racist. It's been law in America since 1971 that's the case. Every corporation, every school has had to operate on that basis, not just tests, but basically any practice. The idea that institutions would be classifying, dividing people by race and sex. Again, it's been a requirement for half a century now. Government has required this for contracting, basically required this to prove non-discrimination. You have to keep statistics to show you're hiring the right balance of people. Even the way we construct race and identity, why we have the Hispanic category, why we have an Asian category, that also can be traced to government policy. We can see these categories exist in government before they really take off, or even exist to any real extent in the wider culture. And you can see that through like Google Ngrams changes over time. And so, yeah, I mean, the wokeness wars. It's like people are, I've seen people say when they hear about my book and they haven't, read it or they don't know anything about it, they say, "Do we really need another book on this?" Usually we don't. I mean, there are so many books and so many articles and so many podcasts. I mean, this is just a topic that people are obsessed with. But the reason I wrote this book is because I think they're missing something very important, is that
Yeah.
like what we're really talking about here is public policy.
Okay. I have a guess, and please humor me. Let me guess why you wrote this book. Are you of Lebanese ancestry?
I'm Palestinian and Jordanian, so close.
Okay. That'll bring up interesting questions with what's going on in the Middle East right now, but that's a later question. So I feel like coming to America, and how old were you when 9/11 happened?
I was about 16.
Okay, so it was like you were a teenager, so it was probably formative. So let me guess, you weren't sure. You were told you fit into the white category on a legal basis, and you saw other people of different races that seemed almost arbitrarily part of different categories. And then you thought to yourself, and also with the anti-Middle East sentiment that was going on at the time, you thought to yourself, why am I arbitrarily, or why am I part of the white category, but someone from India or China is not? And why does that affect my life? Then you looked into the creation of those categories and realized it came from federal policy. Sorry, your audio cut out for a second.
Like, so, we said we're going to talk about maybe later the Israeli
Yeah,
Palestinian dispute. And I was on a Twitter space last night, and someone asked me directly about that, like, does that like personally influence you? And I say,
yeah,
not really. I don't have like an emotional connection to that, any more than any other conflict
yeah,
in the world. The white category makes sense. Like, I know Chinese, it's arbitrary. Obviously, do you
yeah,
want to consider Greeks, or do you want to consider Slavs, or do you want to consider Arabs? It didn't seem that crazy. And I'm from a Christian background too.
yeah.
And I look, pretty light, I'm light skinned. So I really didn't get a lot of the sort of, I don't know, prejudice or feeling of being put upon that a lot of other people in the country did at the time. So no, I was sort of into, I was sort of into like I was like a liberal at the time. I
Yeah.
thought like Bush's wars were stupid, and so like I sort of adopted liberal views on things, standard liberal views. Then I over time switched to libertarianism, a kind of conservatism. But the Middle East was a big deal, and I was interested in like foreign policy and sort of like the foolishness of a lot of our Middle Eastern wars at the time. But just wokeness, I think, was just another separate category of something that
Yeah.
really annoyed me, and I thought about a lot. And I started thinking about the legal aspects of it really when I was in law school, and that's sort of where I got a lot of the ideas of this book.
I like guessing this stuff, so thanks for humoring me. Um,
People can come up with all
Richard,
kinds of theories. There was this person trying to cancel me and said, I was a big racist, and because I worked at McDonald's and I was no good at it, I mentioned that on Twitter once, and they're like, "Oh, he thinks he's a superior man, but he sees he's worse at McDonald's. Like he's not good at manual labor, therefore he became bitter and a racist." And it's like it's fun, you can just take tidbits from people's life and come up with a story.
yeah. People say I'm Jewish, but my genetics are public, and it's very clear that
Me
I'm
too.
not Jewish.
Yes, I'm also. They people say I'm Jewish, and my genetics say I'm Arab with some European ancestry. Yeah.
Yeah.
What is your ancestry?
Dad's side's Irish, mom's side's mostly English.
Gotcha. So not even close. Mine is a little
Yeah.
bit funny because I'm an Arab, so I'm close to Jewish. So like they can accuse me still.
It's
But
funny. It's close but opposite. It's like being Irish and
yeah,
English, where they're like I'd guess that Palestinians and Jews are pretty genetically close and they're
yeah,
geographically close. But like it's with the Irish and the English, where they're close, but they're the opposite, and then they hate each other.
yeah, exactly. So you could say close, or you could say yeah. It's a sort of no. You're just as wrong as you could possibly be.
Yeah.
So, Richard, the thing I'm really keen on, and the word you picked that resonates with me is you use the term policy. You care
Mhm.
about how wokeness is affecting policy or has affected policy. And really, I don't really give a damn what somebody else thinks if they have a particular worldview or whatever. Mine have changed over the years. I did grow up very much left of center. I now consider myself jokingly a radical moderate, if there was such a thing. Um, but policy affects us all, right? And so if certain people have certain mindsets and their positions of power, they're writing laws, they're putting in regulations, and they're governing different federal agencies, et cetera, then that affects all of us. And so I'd love you to speak about that, because I think that, like you said earlier, the fundamental notions of caring about whether blacks are treated well or not, or women, other minorities, those sort of things. I mean, the origins of woke, I think a lot of people have said, yeah, that's great, but things have changed, and it seems to have metastasized into something much greater that is having a significant impact on all of our lives, and especially in the area of policy.
Yeah, and it can't declare victory. So like on Title IX, it originally came because they didn't want women to be discriminated against in education. Today, women graduate from college more than men. They're more involved in student government. Any measure, women are doing better than men. But Title IX is so concerned with the one area where men have more participation than women. Sports, literally the only thing. Like having in college, you have music, you have drama, you have student government, you have even graduating college. Women are doing better, but because men like sports more, we have to have an equal number of athletes. We have to cut men's sports. The government has to go to universities and say, you've got to create a women's rowing team, which nobody cares about. You've got to institute the volleyball team, whether you want to or not.
Well, Richard, we have to call this interview short because you just spouted heresy. You just said that women are doing better in higher education than men are. And if you talk to many people who consider themselves woke, they will tell you that you're absolutely wrong and that is statistically not true. They will make that claim.
It's an insane claim to make at this point. Like women go
They
to
will
college
stare you
more.
straight in the eye and they will say, you're wrong, you're lying.
Well, I mean, they would just be misinformed, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
but they're unwilling. But they're also unwilling to bend on it. They're also unwilling to bend on it. That is a statistical truth. What you just said was true, but I don't think very many people know that.
Women are going to college more than men. I think people do know
and they're
that.
graduating. They graduate at a much higher rate.
I see it in like the New York. I mean, I see it in the New York Times. I mean, I see it in like mainstream liberal publication. I don't think that's really.
I have been busted for that. People on the consider some on the left have told me I am straight up lying.
Yeah,
I mean, for woke people, it's especially for people my age, like woke young people, they're so siloed inside their own echo chambers. They just don't hear any other arguments. They're constantly stuck in this spiral. And so like And the thing is, they just completely deactivate if you give them any kind of argument against their worldview. And so, like, I've literally been on calls with woke people where I'll bring up like Liberia's history, where I'll say like there was a place where African Americans enslaved Native Africans, or I'll say I didn't like Obama's policy on this. And these are not political conversations. I'm just casually dropping this, and then immediate phone call out. And so, because the thing with wokeness, especially among young people, is that if you feel something negative, you have to immediately cut that out of your life. And so it's this recursive system where you're constantly getting more confirmation bias. And then the people who don't like it get removed until it's just more and more and more. And then it becomes like a weird cult.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's different aspects of wokeness. I mean, it's very interesting. Sort of your generation, they had, my generation, they didn't have like the gender identity stuff, right? And like, it seems like it seemed like that really took off because everyone sort of has a sex and has experience with men and women, right? And it's just like a very weird thing, while race, like to a large extent, society is still segregated, right? So it leads to sort of a different dynamic where people aren't obsessed with it, but they could have, false or crazy beliefs on that too.
I think it's important to draw a distinction with what I like to call hyper wokeness and wokeness. Okay, so if we go back to your original argument, the beginning part, which is wokeness evolved out of these policy decisions in our government trying to make the world a better place, right? Trying to make people care about these fundamental things. We would say, okay, that's okay, but that's not what we live in today, right? And I had no problems with quote unquote woke originally. I have the hyper woke, the hyper zealots who are very.
What is the thing you like? What is that? What is the original?
What drove me as a classic liberal was the fundamental belief that the world was unfair, and I wanted it to be more fair.
I agree with that. I think most people do, right?
Okay, and some people care about it a little bit more than others, but I think every good person says, "Yeah, the world isn't terribly fair, and it should be more fair. What can we do about that?" But if you're on and growing up in the '60s and '70s and '80s, we try to institutionalize a lot of those things. And I've experienced police brutality myself as a white guy, and I've seen it in the neighborhoods I grew up in, especially against people of color. And I wrote a column called "Our Nation on Issues of Color" because I grew up in that. And yeah, great, I agree, we agree. But what they're doing now, and they would now want to call me a conservative, which I rail against. Like, no, I'm not a conservative. I'm a moderate at best. But you guys, and Richard makes the point, if you don't agree with everything that is in the hyper woke world's view, then you're now called a conservative.
One of the things I really liked about Richard's book is that it explained a couple of things I didn't understand at the woke movement. One of them is that by my estimate, I think actually woke people are around 8 to 10% of the population, where I think that right left is 50-50 once you remove people who are not involved in politics. And I think most left wingers are just normies who follow along with people on the woke left. But how is it possible that they gain complete control over society? Because you look at almost every single institution is run by woke people, whether the government, the media, most large corporations, the military, a lot of religious organizations, and more. And it's because slight incentive structures towards the top set it up so that there was no reason to not do it. And I understand the sentiment of supporting fairness, but that's something where if you scale it, it ends up, you have to think of these things in terms of centuries. And once you...
No one thinks past 2 minutes, but okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right.
But I mean, like, I think a lot of people set up these incentives right when Jim Crow ended, and there wasn't an understanding that towards the end, that over time, that they would become a beast of their own. And one of the things I've learned from history is that slight changes in incentive structures can have massive changes over the course of history, like the breakdown of the clan in medieval Europe caused individualism, like the Catholic Church banning cousin marriage. And that created a lot of the West's success later on. And the thing that really shocked you reading your book is that it added up when you realize the government's half of the economy, but also the government can do this to random people. Like I remember this is the minor example. I grew up in rural Pennsylvania, and we had a horrible bamboo infestation on our land, and so we hired people to basically remove the bamboo. And they wanted to jack up prices a lot because there was a new federal regulation that they couldn't use a certain type of truck because it had too much climate like problems, and that's spread across the entire economy, but through wokeness, where it's if you like, I really loved your point in the book where you have to police someone's action. Like, if you can get sued millions of dollars if someone in your workplace says something that's incredibly vague, like incredibly vague because there's no real criteria. And it creates this tyranny of basically gossiping and relational warfare that allows wokeness because the government officials involved are the kinds of people who want to push this as far as possible because they see themselves as advocates.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, Rudyard, I mean, you really you hit on something important. Yeah, you sort of distilled the point of the book, and you got into sort of the subtleties of like, yes, I love the of seemingly small, sort of seemingly insignificant, boring minutia of government has large downstream effects. I like the analogy of banning cousin marriage and then that leading to the takeoff of Western civilization, right? Yeah, I mean, like you mentioned, like every institution, right? Like the military has always voted Republican. The majority of people who join the military are not woke. When Trump goes to like, whatever, one of their football games, I mean, you see the standing ovations. They just really love Trump. But somehow the military is obsessed with, DEI and racial diversity too, right? And it's sort of like it's like this is I'm not saying it's as oppressive as Soviet communism, right? I'm not going to make that, but there is an analogy here in the sense that like every institution, and the Chinese Communist Party still does this. Every institution has sort of like a commissar, like making sure everyone adopts the common line. And so we have that with HR and like DEI officers. No, they don't shoot you or they don't send you off to the gulag or whatever. But no, they can determine whether you get hired or fired, whether you get promoted, whether they're looking out for making sure that the company doesn't get sued or doesn't have bad press. And it's not like the sexiest explanation, but it is sort of like a deep sort of systematic explanation. And I'm glad you got that from the book, because that's what I'm really trying to convey to people.
Yeah.
So as a matter of national security and policy, here's an example where this really is affecting us. 80% of all those people who ever served the United States military lived from Texas to the Carolinas. And 80% of those had a family member who served. And the vast majority, as you say, are moderate or conservative, right? And yet, if you look at all the marketing, all the recruitment, et cetera, it has changed recently, and it is going after a group of people trying to say that it's open to people who might be on the left, who might be of color, et cetera, might not be conservative, et cetera. Well, they're targeting a tiny percentage of their marketplace, and they're alienating the bulk of their marketplace of their recruits, right? So it's actually a policy that, first off, if you were a marketing company, you just wouldn't do it. You would say, why am I going after, trying to appeal to two mommies when the person who's most likely is going to be a guy from Alabama who works on a farm, right? So just as a matter of business sense, it doesn't make sense. But it's because there's a deeply held and genuinely held belief that this is right and we should do this. And that's what's driving this. I mean, there is a zealous belief in these principles, and that's what's driving this. And to Richard's point, it's because a number of people, not that many, but those who are zealous are pushing it. And the vast majority are just keeping their mouths shut, crouching down, hoping for the best, and hoping not to get canceled.
Yeah, there is. I mean, there has been data on the last few years that the military has fallen behind on recruiting, and even some of the top officials testifying before Congress have said, this is because of we think it's in part because of the perception that the military has gone woke. Yeah, I mean, the base of the people, who are likely to volunteer for the military, they hear the message. I mean, it's a lot of conservative politicians, a lot of influencers are stressing that point. You do touch on something. It's like, when people say my book is, it really doesn't get into like the sort of like the religious sort of sort of just moral like righteousness a lot of these people have, like, so like like politically correct sort of recruiting. That's, you can't really directly tie that to civil rights law. You could tie a lot of the other stuff, but I do think that like it sort of encourages just sort of a organizational outlook that manifests itself in a lot of ways, including what you're seeing in military recruiting.
Yeah.
Well, real quick, I want to put one last thing out, and I'll shut up. Guys, the Democratic Party and the left has controlled Congress, the White House, and the Supreme Court far more than the Republican Party, by about 2/3. And if you tell people that who will consider themselves left of center, they will again tell you that you're lying, you're wrong. Know that the Republicans have been in power; they're in control, and that is a statistical, irrefutable lie.
Maybe you speak to some very misinformed leftists.
I know a lot of people on the left.
I agree with Dave here. Like a lot of my relatives are super woke, and I grew up partially in Philadelphia, which is really woke. And the stuff that Dave talks about is stuff that like I see all the time, or I used to see before I moved to Texas.
Yeah.
I have a lot of left of center friends, and they don't believe any of the things you just said. They would tell you that you're straight up lying.
No, I know. If you go to conservatives, though, I mean, I think maybe you spend a lot of time with leftists and see where they're wrong. I mean, if you spend a lot of time with conservatives, you'll see they have a lot of crazy misinformation too. I think that's just a common human condition.
Yeah, but this is back to bias, Ridger's point earlier. So please continue.
It's a common human condition in hard times, and it's funny where Richard, are you aware of the Gnosticism left argument?
I think I've heard versions of it, but
okay, basically the left is indirectly a philosophic descendant of Gnosticism, and it's true of Nazism as well, where Gnostics were an ancient religion that believed that the world itself was an evil conspiracy, and that they had gained the hidden truth of how to reach divinity, and they had to share that truth. And that sounds kind of crazy and abstract, but we have records, like legitimate historical records of this being an underground current in European philosophy until Hegel. And we know Hegel was part of this. And that's kind of the left's philosophic worldview, that everything is an evil conspiracy. If something happens, it must be someone else's fault. And that they have the hidden truth that you just have to realize how true it is. And so the left doesn't realize it, but they're taking it from this philosophic current. And it's crazy to meet with left-wingers where nothing is good enough for them. They can have total control over society, and they still think society is an evil, racist, fascist conspiracy. And it's just funny to watch, where I think, what evidence would you guys need to see? Because, I
don't know about the philosophical current argument. I mean, when you describe that, I've read that there's a famous article on this. I forget the author's name, but I think I cited in the book actually. It sounds like QAnon from the way you describe it, right? Everything is a conspiracy. It seems a lot more directly related to QAnon than
it depends on how you frame it, because my comprehension of the world is everyone is in constant Darwinistic competition, and so if one group can get an edge over another, it will. And so, for example, if feminism worked in a previous society, we would have done it 1,000 years ago, because some tribe or country would have realized, if we institute feminism, we can conquer our neighbors. Well, the left's view of the world is that if there's a disparity in anything, it's caused by someone oppressing someone else. The story of history is driven by oppression. And so that's a worldview. I mean, I'm willing to throw away the Gnostic stuff. If I see a really good argument for the left not stemming from Gnosticism, I'll throw away that argument immediately. But the left's worldview is fundamentally built off an image of the world in which oppression is the only story. And in the left's mental model, there is no place for competency. There's no concept that certain groups do certain things right, and then that makes them better off. They just think everything is based off oppression. And that's kind of the far right is also conspiracy theory based. I'm not going to...
Richard was making that point, and both sides have this sort of QAnon view of the world, that there's a cabal, everyone's intending it. People wake up in the morning trying to figure out how to oppress other people, as opposed to just get through their day.
That's what I do in the morning.
Yeah. Well, me too. Yeah. I mean, I think it's just, there is something to the idea that there is oppression in the world, right? The idea that society is all oppression and history is all oppression. I mean, this is the headline the headline is, you know, the Industrial Revolution. The headline is the hockey stick where, you know, we have nothing
Yeah.
and then we have something. And the question is, why do we have something? Right. And they look at we having something and they say, well, the people most responsible for us having something, the capitalists, the rich guys, the West, they are the villains of history. And they're why we don't have even more. Right. It's sort of it's sort of like, yeah, it's a sort of like a completely, it's the world sort of inverted on its head. And you do have like more so like Ibram Kendi, like, you know, like you do have sort of like, you know, the ideas of like structural racism aren't necessarily like always that. I mean, it's sometimes just like, you know, there's subconscious biases that become self-fulfilling prophecies. So that's less conspiratorial. I don't buy it as like an explanation of like American society or how it works. But yeah, this is the sort of, there's a non-conspiratorial version. Same with the right. There's a conspiratorial right and a non-conspiratorial right.
Yeah. The thing that really convinced me of the validity of your argument was you going through the categories we use to describe wokeness, and then those being the exact same things that the government looks for. And so that demonstrates causation, because I've always wondered, why aren't the Jews part of a woke category? Like, if you want to look at any group that's been oppressed over history, the Jews they're a pretty good group to look at. Or even like 20 years ago, there was a decent amount of Protestant Catholic divide in America, but that's never talked about. And but the thing is that the exact categories that woke people care about, or class, like you could make a great argument that America does a lot of class repression today and hurts working people. But the exact things that woke people talk about are the exact things the government penalizes corporations for not following.
Yeah, it's really funny. Yeah, you can worry about Irish versus Italian gaps. You can worry about Swedes versus, I mean, there's massive gaps. I looked at the school standardized test scores of like the highest state and lowest state, just looking at whites, like Massachusetts versus West Virginia. It's a massive gap.
That's inside British Americans too. Like one of my favorite books, Albion Seed, and it's about how these 4 different groups in the British Isles hit all different parts of America. And like, there are absolutely stunning gaps between groups of British Americans.
Yeah. I mean, it was comparable to white Hispanic gap, the Massachusetts whites versus the West Virginia whites. And, you know, we don't care about that. We don't care about Puerto Ricans, you know, versus Venezuelans. I mean, there's all these ways you can cut it. And that's why, like, when people say leftists are just concerned about equality, like, which equality? Like, the world is unequal in a million different ways, and how you divide it and what you do. Okay, like black, okay, we had slavery, right? Native American, we had Native Americans, right? But sort of everything else is sort of up for grabs, right?
Yeah.
In the context of American history. And I mean, just how exact it follows it, I mean, is really remarkable to see.
So it does come from your own self-focus and how you identify, right? So if you identify as a particular group and you feel your group is oppressed, you can use this sentiment, you can use this dynamic to your benefit to gain power, influence, favor, et cetera, right? And some groups do that rather effectively and some don't. But here's what I'm really keen about. I mean, the name of this little program here is called, you know, Common Ground. And it's upsetting to me to live in a country today where we're so divided, et cetera, where we live at a time when we should be incredibly happy to be alive. We're living better than any group of humans has ever lived, and yet we're so dissatisfied. So the issue for me is the tail is wagging the dog. And Redford pointed that out earlier, that 6, 7, 8, 9%, whatever the number is, seems to be driving an agenda pretty much for all of us. And if you take most people and you shove them in a room together and you give them an issue, whether it's immigration or any other policy question, they can come to a reasonable accommodation, whether they identify as left of center, center, right, et cetera. But if you interject somebody who is an absolute zealot, right, who is, has drunk the Kool-Aid, makes the Kool-Aid, wore the T-shirt, all that, there's no negotiating. And if you veer at all from doctrine, they will go after you.
Yeah, I mean, it is a sense of identity for people, and people sort of need the identity more than they care about like the actual issues. Like, I mean, I've seen so the AAPI thing is so amazing to me, because it's like there was an experiment. Let's see how ridiculous we can make it. Asian American Pacific Islander. Let's just put random stuff together. And then during COVID, like you see it everywhere. Stop AAPI hate. It has nothing to do with AAPI. It's China, right? The virus came from China, and people cared about that. Maybe they were mean to Chinese people, even though I think that was very exaggerated. I think that was, just like sort of a media narrative. But like, even if you accept that, like you're talking about hate against, Indians from India, right? And like people from, Solomon Islands, and like, what does this have to do with
Those are
anything?
not connected, but by connecting them, you get a broader appeal for purchasing.
But people believe this. They're not just getting their advantage. Like, they actually believe this. Like, I think there are people who work for AAPI organizations. I think they wake up and they say, I am an Asian American.
It's remarkable because people think they gain. Our society doesn't have a philosophic concept of wisdom. And what I mean by that is we think if you just feed more information to someone, they'll get the correct answer. But the reality is wisdom is a trait you grow yourself in your ability to discern judgment. And so, and the thing with woke people is they don't have a frame of reference except their own little retarded argument. Like, for me personally, I try to look over the course of history and think over the course of human history, does this make sense? But no one in wokeness does that. And so they get stuck in their own little logical rabbit holes. And I mean, if I'm being totally blunt, if you look at the demographics of woke people, and there's this wonderful chart that shows this, it compares mental illness and sex by political affiliation. And young, far left young female women have 4 times the mental health problems of any other demographic. And so what you're looking at is a demographic, which I think it's driven in a lot of ways by the growth of social media, is literally mentally unwell, and it's running society.
Yeah, I mean, the guy who puts together these graphs, you've probably seen. Zach Goldberg used to work for me at CSPI. Yeah, you're absolutely right. The mental illness sort of, and Nietzsche is very good on this sort of, like the sort of the how a lot of sort of ideas come from sort of something that's going on within someone's body, right? It's some kind of physiological thing. We've gotten away from that. People, like, because the social scientists are all leftists. Look, imagine if the results were opposite. Imagine if conservatives had 5 times or something the mental illness of liberals. It would be front page of New York Times. The CDC is saying, follow the science. This is a public health crisis. We need to interfere with these communities.
I mean, that happens. Where the thing is, if you measure right versus left wingers have higher IQ. If you measure Republicans versus Democrats, Republicans have higher IQ. If you break it up by age category, most of the very smartest people are libertarians. But all the leftist media went with that one story that people on the left have higher IQ than people on the right, while ignoring all the other data that said stuff that was contrary.
Why would you not do that?
Intellectual honesty.
Yes, absolutely. And intellectual honesty is not important to you, but winning is.
Yeah.
And it seems to be that most people today care about winning. Intellectual honesty is unimportant. And I identify as largely Scotch-Irish, right? But I am also a very small amount of Native American. I'm a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation, and I am part Jew, right? I'm all of these things. I'm French, Dutch, Black Dutch, et cetera, all these, but 3/4 Scotch-Irish. And I come from Oklahoma, so I have a certain affinity for Native Americans, et cetera, and I can speak enough Chickasaw to get in trouble. My grandmother's name was Awana, which means fire on the water, and that colors my thinking. I'm very pro-Native American, and I think all you guys are damn invaders, right? All illegals, right? All right, so that seems natural. And that being true, if you don't care about intellectual honesty and all you care about is tribe, you will use, and I was a follower of Alinsky, right? I can quote all 13 rules, right? 4th rule is hold your enemy to their standard, and they can't keep up. You can't live up to your own standards, and so I can use hypocrisy as a weapon, and that seems to be what's happening. Hypocrisy has been weaponized.
Yeah, can you really do all 13 rules of Alinsky? Yeah, off the top of your head, it's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Liberals have training camps.
I'll summarize them. Use the favorite tactic. Change the tactic because your people get tired of the tactic. 13 is attack and vilify people. People can't deal with ridicule. Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, I can't remember what I had for breakfast. That's pretty good.
Well, they're too long. They should be like 4 words long. But anyway.
Yeah.
So the point is this: we all have biases, et cetera, and I know I'm a product of mine.
Yeah, and that's why, yeah, when the people ask me about the Palestinian Israeli thing, like I really go out of my way not to be biased, right, in that way. It's like nobody can perfectly, remove all biases, like especially the gender bias. Like men and women are very different. Like when I see the things that women like upset them or like what they're attracted to or how they see relationships, I sometimes say, you know what, maybe that's a woman's way of looking at it. I have a different view. Like when I see a man like making an argument that I think is dumb, I could be like, you know what, you're similar enough to me that like I can say you're wrong and this and that. But then like a woman will make the argument and I'll be like, look, women are just so different. Like I can see how you can have a completely different intuition, right?
But
So
Richard,
yeah, so
you live in a different time than I did because when I grew up and I believed it, we were told that women and men are exactly the same.
oh no, we're still pretty much
This
like
is a
that.
big generational shift because for guys in my age group, Andrew Tate's the norm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's amazing.
And
Yeah.
Gloria
No,
Steinem was my norm.
yeah, we're so yeah. I'm like in between. We have like each generation. We have like three
Yeah.
generations.
Now you guys are
Yeah,
still you're wrestling with this, and I think your point is I've changed my view, which is we're some things are typically more masculine and more feminine, but men and women are different. Get over it, Dave.
yeah. I mean yeah. I think for my generation, it's probably like they are different, but we should all like. It was never the case where like when I was in high school, like the like feminists complain like, oh, different standards, men and women, right? Like they slut shame women, but men are not. That was this is some part of a class thing too. I grew up maybe a little more lower class, and that double standard was there 100%, still 100% there, right? I don't know if it ever went away, lower class. I think the lower class is never ever as woke as probably people who grew up around
Depends
leftists.
regionally. Like I have a couple of friends from working class backgrounds. In like Boston, that's the case. And if you're in a blue state, it's definitely the case. And for high schoolers, it's definitely the case around the country because the education system everywhere basically got hijacked by leftists.
That's right, but I wonder. So here's a funny thing. So in the Soviet Union, they would often be shocked. They would go to the peasants and they would see that they were still religious, right? They still had an internalized socialist idea, so they were shocked by it. I saw a video on Twitter that I posted not that long ago, where like they would go to like these. They would go to these young people at some, I don't know, some club, some rave, some Mardi Gras or something like that, and they
Yeah.
would just ask them, can a man have or can a woman have a penis or something like that, just some trans ideological thing. And you think, me and you are educated, all three of us are educated, we think that everyone has at least heard of this argument, like it's not, but these were guys, like just drunk guys, like young, probably your age, probably your age or even younger, who are like, women have a penis, like they hadn't even heard of trans ideology. So you're like, the education system was taken over by the leftists. You're right, but like people aren't learning, the schools suck, people aren't even
Yeah.
learning, they're
I
not
think
even
that
learning what they're trying to teach them.
I think Hollywood was a big turning point, and I see this in a lot of culture where the fact that like every movie being put out in Hollywood, that is something that will reach even to the bottom of the social totem pole. And
Yeah,
I think that was a lot of one thing that really shocks me at the left is that they have no understanding of practical incentive structures. They don't think if we push people far enough, they'll fight back. Or like why do we shit on the people in our coalition as terrible people? And so they set up all these like logical incentive structures to basically just get slapped in the face. And that's what I see with Hollywood, where I think um, if you guys had pushed wokeness about a third less than you did, you could probably hold on to this for centuries, but you had to
yeah,
push it that extra further step, which will probably wipe you out.
So that's the
yeah,
Bill Maher sort of phenomena, right?
Yeah.
Where even folks, and I'm sort of count myself as someone in the Bill Maher vein, right? Even though I'm not as funny, not as rich, and certainly not as rude. But he has said, wait a minute, when Mellencamp said 90% of all blacks in America, no, I'm sorry, 99% of all blacks in America live worse than they did under slavery. He said that recently. Bill Maher went, what the hell?
The rebuttal to that is why did you end slavery?
Okay, I guess he's advocating.
Why did no one think of that?
Yeah, no, I did. I said,
who said this, who said
slavery was
blacks
too
live
big.
worse than under slavery?
Like
John
90% of
Mellencamp.
all of blacks
John
live
who?
in conditions
John Cougar
further.
Mellencamp. He was a
Really, he said
rocker.
that on the Bill Maher show? How did I miss this? Wow,
No, Bill,
that's
Um,
hilarious. It looks like, no, he was on Bill. This story says he was on Bill Maher's
okay.
podcast.
I didn't see that. All I cared about was that the statement was made that the majority of blacks live in conditions worse than slavery. Bill Maher pushed back, and then
Yeah.
Mellencamp caved in a little bit and said, okay, well, maybe it's only 90% live worse than
Yeah.
slavery.
And then we'll pull that number out of my ass. What an amazing thing. Yeah, what an amazing thing. What a
What's so
story.
amazing about that to me is John Cougar Mellencamp has considered himself a long time advocate for the working man,
Yeah.
a liberal, et cetera. And he believes this. He solemnly he thinks he's right.
Yeah, I think we like, I was talking to someone from Korea and they told me like, I'm like, do like athletes and like singers and actors like have political opinions? They're like, no, people would say, what are they doing? And I think that's like a healthier, like, why do we think that like artists like should like have any insight into these political issues anyway,
Yeah.
right? And when they often talk, they're just so stupid. And you can see like, fine, you're just like a singer. You're not like, you're not a political
You're a guy
analyst.
who happens to sing well.
It's a
Yeah, or an
society in
athlete. I mean,
decline.
you could throw a ball into a hoop, great. I mean, it's a great talent, but
Yeah.
it doesn't mean you know anything about the world.
It's there's Darwinistic competition and there's sexual competition. Darwinistic is that if I don't get this right, the next tribe over will kill me. Sexual competition is I want to be popular to get laid. These two things operate across the human condition. In safe times, sexual competition gets bigger. So people go for those who are popular with no assessment of their actual survival value. And so people have said for thousands of years, a healthy society is one that glorifies the general, the politician, and the intellectual, or the priest. A society in decline glorifies the athlete, the actor, the chef.
Yeah, there might be a historical. There might be. Yeah, I mean, I would. Yeah, the analysis is interesting, right? Yeah, you look at like sort of American society in like 1940s and 50s, right? They have this sort of masculine ideal, right? And that you move away from that as like the country is peaceful.
Yeah.
Historically, yeah, I think like you have it with like it's interesting. Like China sort of seems to realize that they're trying to do the opposite. They're trying to like make their people think they're in war. So have you seen these stories where they're banning you can't portray gay relationships and you can't portray a man as
Yeah.
sissy. They're afraid of K-pop, and it's like they're trying to create without having a war. They're trying to create the warlike atmosphere where like they're trying to change
Kind
like
of crazy.
So I do have a friend who is a Chinese dissident, escaped and spent 3 years here, highly educated PhD, who believed solemnly for 3 years that America invaded North Korea in order to invade China, that we were the aggressor, that we went in there, we did that, et cetera, and that North Korea did not, in fact, try to invade South Korea. And it took
yeah
3 years for her to come to that because she had been told this all of her life and solemnly believed it and thought we were lying. So the Chinese do that, and they do that because they consider themselves on a wartime footing against the rest of the world, right? They hate America, they hate the West. They call the last century the century of humiliation. Whereas we who have affluence and peace have the ability to stare at our navel and care about what the Kardashians are doing.
yeah
And
yeah
our TikTok looks different than their TikTok, right?
yeah, and I think they're worried that if they let like freedom of speech, I mean, they'll probably end up like not like us, like Korea probably, because K-pop would take over. I mean, I think this is the sort of like K-pop, anime. I mean, the other Asian societies have gone in that direction. You need like a dictatorial regime to sort of prevent that, given the absence of actual war in East Asia. Yeah, I would wonder what happens to you like Ukrainian like sex symbols and stuff. Like I wonder what's happened like since the war
They probably
started.
don't care much about frivolous things in the Ukraine right now.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking too. Yeah.
Hmm. I have a question for you, Richard. Where do you see wokeness going? Because for me, the way I look at it is I don't know where else they can. It seems like they've burnt their fuse. And the reason I say that is I look at like woke corporations, they've driven themselves to the ground. Woke organizations, wokeness seems to burn the social capital of an organization so fast that I can't see them surviving. But I also don't see legitimate ideological competitors. And so, where do you see wokeness going over the next, let's say, 5, 10 years?
I think that there's always like sort of waves, right? Like there, it's you can't like it's like people say, oh, the number of trans or bi young people is going up. It's not going to go up to 100%, right? Eventually, like it's a trend, and then trends sort of go away. And then so like at the summer of George Floyd in 2020, that was crazy. Every corporation was speaking like the exact same words and saying the exact same thing. That didn't last. It wasn't going to last. Now the question is, like, how much of this stuff will stay latent, and how long will it, like, how much will it be there to sort of explode, and how much will institutions continue to be obsessed with race and sex and sexual orientation? My argument in the book is this is law. It can be done away with law. So like the answer has to be it depends on the politics. I mean, people ask me what is going to be the influence of the Harvard decision of the Supreme Court. I say it's a boring question, but it's a boring answer. But it's going to be, it's going to depend on what the next court cases say, who the president is going to, who's going to win the presidency in 2024, and who's going to hold the Senate. Because like you can fire like an artillery, you can lob some artillery at your enemy. They scatter. If you don't follow it up with anything, they're going to regroup, and they're going to go back, and they're going to go back to the exact same position and do the exact same thing. So it's like it's an important decision. Which way it goes is a political battle. Me writing this book is part of it. I am confident that like Republicans will probably win elections sometimes. And when they do win the elections, they're gonna, and in the places where they have power now in the states, they are going to be listening to my argument and arguments like mine. People get it. I mean, there is an appetite for, okay, we're not complaining about this stuff. That's why the civil right, wokeness, the civil rights law has really taken off. Chris Rufo's doing some good stuff, not the exact same stuff, but focusing on the education system, which is also good. And so, yeah, I'm optimistic on wokeness. I think the country has other problems, but I think we're going to get better, at least on this front.
So I do like your pendulum sort of notion that things come in waves, et cetera, and they change, et cetera. It also relates to what Richard said earlier about having been not quite as zealous about it if they've been a third less sort of strident about this. For example, if we take the Bud Light example, I think if they'd have picked RuPaul as their spokesperson, that actually could have worked. RuPaul probably would have made fun of himself, et cetera. He would have been humorous, et cetera. And a lot of, guys in Carhartts living here in Salina, Texas, where I live, wouldn't have given a damn.
Dylan Mulvaney also makes fun. I mean, Dylan Mulvaney makes fun of himself better than anyone I've ever heard.
Dylan Mulvaney's more hateable.
On YouTube, there might be.
And I can't have a logical argument for why Dylan Mulvaney is more hateable. He just is.
No, well, I can. I can tell you why. He's a parody of women, and he does things, and he also tries to be a little girl. Yeah, and I liken him to the Andrew Tate of the woke movement. I mean, he's such an extreme example. Whereas if they had gone with someone like a RuPaul, who's funny and likable, et cetera, RuPaul has an incredibly successful show among men watch it. I mean, it's whatever. But RuPaul wasn't doing bra ads. He wasn't doing feminine hygiene or tampon ads. He wasn't as extreme. So this is back to Rudyard's point. If one was a little bit more modest, et cetera, in this and et cetera, one pushed the envelope gently. And I mean, today we will see ads. Almost every ad you see on TV shows a gay couple, a non-binary couple or something like that, as an expression of saying, "Hey, we are supportive. We're LGBTQ plus. We're L plus supportive." And I don't think Middle America or any part of America has any problem with that. The Mulvaney thing was so extreme that people finally went, "Whoa, stop."
I think it's sort of, I sort of thought, I had a very unique sort of Dylan Mulvaney take, which is like, this actually reinforces like male and female differences because it's like a parody of women. It's like sort of like, how they used to cross dress in the 1950s, like as a joke, right? Like American soldiers when, Navy, members of the Navy would do that. It's sort of like, it's such a, I think it's actually like sort of subversive for like in the anti-woke direction. So I think that it was sort of like I commented that like, conservatives should maybe be a little bit pro Dylan Mulvaney. I mean, it really sort of reinforces gender differences.
Something I've seen where in a lot of ways Gen Z is more prude about sex than previous generations. You see that in both the right and the left in different ways, where for the left, if a guy does something wrong, he's canceled, it's horrible. Don't pick up a girl at a coffee shop or something, or don't pick up your waitress. That's bad form. So the left's more prude. The right is obsessed with like body count and not being cucked. And so on both the right and the left, you see this greater prudishness than previous generations. Although it's funny how it comes around, where for the left, because they're so sexually open, they end up becoming prude in a roundabout way.
Yeah, I mean, it's the worst of all worlds, it seems to me. Like the sort of leftist young people, right? It's like gender confusion and all the uh, sort of the discomfort and sort of awkwardness and obsessions, but none of the fun or starting families
Yeah,
or having
it's
relationships or the things that are good.
the
Yeah,
great irony about the left is that if you meet a young left wing person, they will happily tell you about all the flaws in their lives. They're like, I have incredible anxiety, I'm broke, I'm depressed. And you say, okay, great. Here are 5 solutions you can do to those problems. Then they'll say you're evil.
yeah. I mean, conservatism versus leftism. I mean, in like sort of the younger generation and like the popular, like on TikTok or like YouTube, the world of Andrew Tate and influencers, it's almost like optimism versus pessimism. It's like there is, I think people like Tate and like the old before that we had like pickup artists. I think what's fascinating about these sort of phenomena is that they combine political critique with self-help advice,
Yeah.
right? Because these things are related, and there is sort of a just a deep way in which people's psychologies and sort of how they navigate the world is sort of connected to how they see things
Yeah.
politically.
Among young people, the left selects for it selects for sympathy, status seeking, and agreeability. The right selects for masculinity and competency. And so, I mean, I don't know how much of my videos you watch, but one of my predictions is that the right just crushes the left in a future conflict.
It's a good, this is a good argument, and you see it at the highest level. So like Kamala Harris is a terrible politician. Like there was
Yeah,
just a New York Times profile of her, and like even the New York Times can't be nice. Like they're like people are feeling awkward at her speeches. They don't know when to clap. They
yeah,
don't laugh. Like the New York Times is just like this is like so cringe. She's just like terrible at this. And the reason she's there is because Biden said, "I'm going to pick a black woman." Right now, the Supreme Court justices. I mean, they're Sonia Sotomayor. They're not heavy hitters. I mean, the people who are getting appointed to judgeships. The judges are the most. You probably get that idea from my book. The judges are some of the most important people in our system. Biden is basically appointing very very few white males. They're all overwhelmingly
black female.
women and minorities. I mean, the numbers are absolutely massive, and this is a recent phenomenon. This is just like Biden, like Bill Clinton, still appointed a lot of whites, and overwhelmingly
yeah,
white men. And it's like the liberal justices are all going to rule the same way, but like it actually matters strategically. And like I've talked to people like who've been law clerks, so like just to make sure, like it actually matters, like who's competent. They're like yes, because there's a lot in like legal decision making, in which cases you take, how you word them, where you send them.
yeah,
That is about competence. That it's about strategy, and the fact that the rights people are smarter. Now, it's not like a perfect theory because the left is also, the left is on average higher education, right? On
yeah,
average. But the affirmative action is so intense that when you get to the highest level of who's getting the judicial, who's getting the judgeships, and who gets to be vice president, right? I mean, they're
yeah.
shooting themselves in the foot at the
I
highest
mean,
levels.
So
also, like, please, Dave.
there's an interesting sort of unexpected racism associated with Kamala Harris, which was that any black woman would be fine. Not you want to find the most competent, best black woman. He could have found an incredibly competent politician, strategist, administrator, etc. But I guess he says, I guess they're all the same. No, they're not all the same. And I don't think that when you look at a white person, if he'd have chosen a white male, he would have said, I'll just pick any white male because they're conservative. He would have said, no, I'm going to find the competent white male or any other whatever. But it was just sort of, she just took it on faith that this would be, and even though she did horribly against him in her campaign, etc., was a horrible DA, was a racist DA, went after and put more black people in prison for small crimes than anybody in U.S. history. I mean, just pick any black woman. Really?
Yeah. It's to jump off your point, Richard, it's the right has much more competent, but it's also actively selecting for sociopaths because you get masculinity and competency that leaves sociopaths. And the thing is, the right at this point selects for sociopaths, the left selects for narcissists and like histrionics. And it's really remarkable to see because I think I got this off your Twitter actually, where 94% of new company hires since or in the aftermath of COVID were not white. And so that especially hits young white men. And I've got a couple different points I'm jumping off, but your point about Harvard and higher education is that I've met like 10 people who went to Harvard my age group, and I've interviewed a couple to work in my staff. And the thing is that they're not really good hires in a lot of cases. And they're often incredibly intelligent, but they come from backgrounds where their parents structured their entire lives to get into Harvard. And then so they're not really good team players. They're incredibly anxious. They are stuck in boxes, and they're designed for a very specific bureaucratic large corporation. And so if you want them to operate with a group of people, they're just not really good. And so it's the filtering mechanism you use for higher education was not actually an effective filtering mechanism to deal with the chaos of life. And that's something that growing up Gen Z, for Gen Z, they spent everything. Gen Z's got a filtering mechanism. For people who are in lower social classes, they often come from backgrounds with drugs, broken families, etc. That's very dissolute. And for those of higher social class, it tends to be their parents helicoptered them and designed their entire life to go to college. And so for that group, there's not really an expectation of how chaotic and how crazy the world is. And so I don't think our higher education did a good job of, we had higher education that didn't set people up for how the world really is.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you're right. You said it selects for, the liberalism selects for histrionics. Yeah, it also conformists, right?
Yeah.
It is just jumping through hoop after hoop. One of the things I'm hopeful for is that education becomes less important. Like didn't finish college, you're doing very well and you're reaching a lot of people. I went to a lot of school, I finished college and PhD and all that, but I'm not in academia anymore, right? I'm speaking to people sort of like you are, directly through Twitter, through Substack, through books. And yeah, I mean, I think more and more people will realize in different areas of life, whether they're going to be intellectuals or people who write books, or they're going to be people who want to go and start their own business, that there's not you can go out there and you can do yourself. And this is what right versus left, what you're talking about, what's each is selected for. I mean, it's not like the fact that Silicon Valley, I'm told that most people, like most Silicon Valley elites, are still pretty leftist, but the fact that there is like a major contingent of like very famous people like Elon Musk and Andreessen and Peter Thiel, who are right wing, is because they had to go out on their own and they built something in the real world, while people who just climb to the top of academia are writing things for peer review, filing grants, not getting in trouble with their committee or whatever. There is just sort of, it's like you have this space for the conformists, you have space for sort of like masculinity and competence. And what we should want is to grow that latter space, not like necessarily you're going to take over this feminized sort of bureaucratic conformist space. No, you're going to grow your space that is good at the expense of the other one. That happens naturally over time because economic growth, like we just get wealthier, the economy gets bigger, there's more opportunities out there. Like college professors, like relative to like the population, I think pretty much keep getting or keep getting poorer. Like it doesn't, the increase in the private sector goes up for like the top level more than it does in the public sector. And so there's hope out there, and technology, right? Technology is a great democratizing force, right? We have YouTube and Substack, all these things where you could reach people like you couldn't before. You don't have to go through the gatekeepers. So for all these reasons, I'm just sort of like optimistic on wokeness and liberalism more generally. I think your sort of analysis of society and where it is, I think, is absolutely correct.
Do you I'm curious, as I read your book, the book it reminded me the most of is Leviathan and Its Enemies by Samuel Francis. Do you know that book?
I've read Francis. I read a lot of his columns. I don't think I've read that book.
The thesis of Leviathan and Its Enemies is that after World War II, we saw the rise of a managerial elite. And then basically the left exists to give people with college degrees more power. And as I read your book, what I saw was and we talked about this on email before you came on the podcast, but was the attempt to basically give college educated people as much authority as possible And I see that with the government policies, where it's college educated government bureaucrats trying to basically give authority to other college educated people in private enterprise. And I see that divide really starkly, where it's, and then the right is an alliance of people who are not part of that. You've got merchants, you've got old religious authorities, the military, etc. And people don't like to think in those terms, but if you look back over history, there are certain points where the priest class of the nobility or whatever tried to take over an ancient society. So if you accept that'll happen in other periods of history, you can accept that that can happen today.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, it's very sort of. I think it's like, yeah. I mean, it's good not to fall into the trap of thinking like this is sort of a like a leftist plan to increase its power or anything like that. I do think the sort of the managerial, like the Burnham kind of managerial class, I think is too broad. A lot of these things are just sort of, um, they're based on like public opinion. Like people like credentialism, right?
Yeah.
People like the idea of everyone going to college and like getting people always wanted the government to spend more on education. The kids like the idea of sort of just going on vacation for 4 years and having these nice dorms and having all the meal plan and everything taken care of for you. It was just sort of
extending childhood.
Yeah, exactly. We did this sort of we slept walked into this. And then, yeah, of course, they needed jobs. But then, like, because so many people went to college, like, it became a negative sign if you didn't go to college. So, like, people would prefer college degrees, which required people to go to college more. And so, yeah, there is. I'm just, I'm hopeful because, like, these arguments of like what we did wrong, they're out there. Like, even like the idea that like you should have like a more you should have more, a sort of, a blue collar sort of job trading instead of college. Like, Obama would make community college, like Obama and Biden, like they talk like this sometimes. And so, yeah, I think these ideas are getting out there, and that's absolutely right. There is a connection between leftism, mental illness, extended childhood. This stuff all fits together.
But credentialism is one I really love the fact that you brought up, which is we want surety. We'd like to know that if it has this stamp, it's USDA approved, whatever, we're going to be okay, right? And if the person goes through these hoops and gets this degree, then they're a good choice. And I got them, right? So therefore, I want to hire my own image. So if I'm going to hire other college educated people because that seems to be the way. It is too random. It is too chancy. It is too fraught with, I have to pay attention to hire people and see how they do and promote them based on their accomplishments, as opposed to, we're going to filter and we're going to pick. I was the head of recruiting for one firm, and they said, Dave, we need a process so that we never make a bad hire. Really? Good luck with that. No, you will make bad hires. People will slip through the cracks. Some people will work hard. Some people won't. And you're not going to really know until you get to you give them a chance to get in the job. And then you have to reward them and promote them accordingly. That managers, this is Richard's point, the managerial class doesn't want that. They want simple, they want clean, they want credentials, they want surety, they want to reduce risk. And I'm sorry, a college degree is not the answer to that.
That leads back to Richard's point, though, where in his book, he said that all of these government policies are towards risk mitigation. And so it creates a culture of risk mitigation in large organizations because these government policies and what they fuck you over are pretty arbitrary. And so you're constantly thinking about, what could someone do that I could get really fucked over because there's no clear rule set.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. Yeah, yeah. I mean, it is sort of the invisible hand, right? It's sort of the shadow of the civil rights lawyer, the bureaucrat, the judge, always behind you. And, bosses, CEOs, and managers, they're not thinking about this stuff all the time. This takes up 1 or 5% of, depending on how extreme it is, of their thought process. They're usually thinking about the job, right? They're usually thinking about making software or delivering customer service or whatever. They outsource it to the HR people. They outsource it to the activists. Okay, someone is yelling at me. What can I do? Who's yelling at me? Do X, Y, Z. Okay. HR says, okay, take care of it. Right. That's it. That's all this stuff is. there are these like leftists of the right, like there are these like socialists of the right who talk about like, woke capital. This is this is sort of a conspiracy or like a way for like business to get ahead, to divide the working class who would otherwise come together and take away their power. No, it's not that. They don't want this headache. That's all they want. They're just trying to go through their life. They're trying not to have a headache. And usually that means just be woke, because that's where the law is and that's where all the noisy activists are. And our people, our job is to just change their incentive structure.
But would you say that's clearly less risky to be woke-ish or woke than to be considered conservative?
Yes, I mean by a lot, right? Because you're never sued for being, it's changing. I mean, it's changing because some of the law firms have like changed their programs that were, like they would have like, oh, this fellowship is only available to, minority women or something like that. There's been news stories where they're going away with that because of the way the courts are, and because sort of conservatives and conservative like lawyers and activists have been focusing on these things. So it's changed a little bit, but historically, yes. I mean, you look at like how often like corporations have been sued or had big payouts for discriminating against women versus discriminating against men. It probably existed at some point, but I think I've almost never heard of a case of discrimination against men going to court or a big settlement based on that. So yeah, absolutely. You always lead in the direction of what leftists care about.
One of the things that really shocked me from your book was the story of Walmart in California, where a black guy who was it Walmart? I forget the exact big company.
I think you're thinking of Tesla.
Oh, Tesla, you're right. Yeah. And this black guy who was there and working there, and I think he was a temp, and he heard some discriminatory stuff. And the jury awarded him $135 million for being insulted. And then the state of California lowered that to $15 million. But the thing is, like, that's a ludicrous sum of money, and it's just unbelievable. And it breaks your mind.
Yeah, I mean, 15 million. Call me whatever you want. Like, how is that even close to proportional? I mean, put me in a room and cuss at me for 96 hours straight. I mean,
the most dangerous jobs in the world, like being an Alaskan crab fisher.
Yeah.
What do you make, like $70K a year, $100K a year?
Right. Yeah, it wasn't even like that. I mean, it was arguably like friendly. It was disputed, like sort of. But even if it's insult, I mean, even if it was insults, my goodness, it's just not proportionate. Some legal systems, this is just part of it. Some legal systems don't have punitive damages. You just sue. Okay, you're hurt. You lost this job because of discrimination.
Hurt for being hurt emotionally.
Yeah, but
the insulted in many countries doesn't exist.
I mean, it wasn't a thing 50 years ago, 100 years ago. Like, it's crazy to see how much we've dismantled our traditional legal code, because back in the day, like for all of our history as English speakers, we've had the concept of intentions matter more than effect, and guilty until proven, or innocent until proven guilty, and
the right to disagree,
actual physical things over emotional effect. And we threw that all out the window, and no one even talked about it. It wasn't like when we threw that out the window, people didn't even think about it. Also, freedom of speech.
Yeah, I mean, I do say at some point in the book that civil rights, we haven't really grappled with the extent to which civil rights, quote unquote, civil rights, has been in tension with all other rights, right? Pretty much all other rights. Freedom of speech, you brought up freedom of association, economic liberty, freedom of religion. They're all always being challenged, and it's always civil rights versus, one of these things or a series of them. And yeah, I mean, this is the point of the book, telling people to push back against it.
Well, one of you two touched on this earlier, which is that these things never end. I will continue to argue that the time in the 60s and 70s and into the 90s, when I was pretty active in this, there was a need for this. I knew straight up, very open racists. They used the N-word like it was an adjective, or what it was like an article or preposition. I mean, it was just common speech, et cetera. And they believed that. They said these things. And we led marches and we got in fist fights and all this kind of shit. And great. They existed. I would argue that kind of bias, even at a subconscious level, has been driven out of our society and our culture. And I would have to look really damn hard to find someone like that. I'd have to probably go to Vidor, Texas, where the headquarters of the KKK is, in order to find people who actually ascribe to those views now.
Yeah. I mean, like, they're often not the most think they're still racist, but they're often the least, it's sort of like they're the least powerful people in society often, right? They're often like the most backwards. They don't
Right.
have.
And that's not the belief, though, that
I
they're
also think
everywhere and that they're in power.
there's
Yeah.
also very different things we're talking about. I think traditional racism is basically dead, like the racism you see in the 60s. I think that you can see you're starting to see a flare up in a completely different kind of racism. And that's all due to wokeness. I think if wokeness didn't exist, you would not see this flare up of different racism. But like it's perfectly acceptable in large parts of the right to talk about like racial differences, eugenics, etc. And I think that's going to be a big movement because frankly, the stuff coming out about racial differences over the last 5 years is so scientifically damning that I don't see philosophically how it wouldn't happen. But that's a completely different philosophic trajectory. And it comes out of wokeness. It's a demon that the woke.
It's a self-defense mechanism against hyper wokeism.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, that's all those things. Yeah, I mean, Peter Singer warned leftists on this. Like, if you're going to base leftism on the idea that all groups are identical, you're not going to be able to defend it if it comes out that it's not true. Now, liberals can sort of suppress sort of knowledge for a very long time, but with the internet the way that it is, it looked like. I mean, what a different world we are from 3 years ago. What a different world. Just
It's insane.
Elon Musk buying Twitter, has made, and it made every other like social media site have to sort of keep up. I hear from people that Facebook, for example, is not as bad as it was a few years ago because they have competition now and there's sort of a market force. So yeah, I mean, it's just sort of amazing how much has changed. And they're not going to be able to suppress any kind of and even disinformation. Some things that are not true are going to get out there just because they're popular and they sound good. We're just sort of going to have to get used to that.
Yeah. I want to really grab lunch. I'm really hungry and I want to grab lunch. Any final points?
No, I mean, everyone, please. There's so much in the book. Like I think you're going to read it and you're going to understand, like, you're going to look back and you're going to say, wow, there's like so much about my society that I sort of understand now. I sort of know the historical sort of basis of where it came from. If you're an activist or you want to talk to people or like, push people a certain direction, there's also sort of advice on what to do about it. So like, don't think that the conversation exhausted the book. There's a lot in there that people benefit from.
I can agree with that.
Absolutely. Well, Richard, thanks for your time. Thanks for writing the book. And I think this is Richard's entire life. If you don't study history and don't learn from it, you're going to repeat it.
Appreciate it. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much for coming. I will stop the recording.